The crowbar was rusted, hadn't been touched in years. But when the old man picked it up, something changed in the room. The young mechanics had been wrestling with that wheel for over an hour, sweating, cursing, ready to call it a defective part and move on. What happened next would teach them something no manual ever could. You're about to see why experience beats education every single time. Type respect in the comments if you believe in the wisdom of those who came before us. Fort Hood, Texas. Motor pool. 7:30 in the morning and already hot enough to make the air shimmer above the concrete. The smell of diesel and grease and hot metal hung in the bay like a fog that never lifted. This was where vehicles came to be fixed, where broken things were made whole, and where young soldiers learned that the army ran on maintenance as much as it ran on courage. 3 specialists stood around a Humvee that had been jacked up since yesterday afternoon. The right rear wheel assembly sat on the floor beside them, and the new wheel they were trying to mount leaned against the fender like an accusation. They'd been at this for an hour of trying to align the lugs, an hour of muscle and frustration, and increasingly creative profanity. Specialist Derek Torres was 23 years old, and had graduated top of his class from the Army's Wheeled Vehicle Mechanic course at Fort Lee. He had certifications, he had awards, he had a confidence that came from never having encountered a problem his training couldn't solve. Until now. "This is ridiculous," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a greasy rag. "The lugs won't align. It's a manufacturing defect. Has to be." Specialist Amy Chen, 21, nodded in agreement. She'd been holding the wheel in position while Torres tried to thread the first lug nut, and her arms were shaking from the effort. "Maybe we got a bad batch. The tolerance is off or something." The third mechanic, Specialist Marcus Webb, was the youngest at 19. He stood back, watching, not sure enough of himself to offer an opinion, but smart enough to know that something wasn't working. "I'm writing it up," Torres said, reaching for the clipboard on the workbench. "Defective wheel assembly. Recommend replacement from depot." He started filling out the form, his handwriting sharp and precise. By the book. Everything by the book. In the corner of the motor pool, sitting on an overturned oil drum with a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand, an old man watched. He'd been there since before the young mechanics arrived, had watched them unload the wheel from the supply truck, had watched them struggle and sweat and curse. His name was Earl Jessup, 64 years old. Grey hair under a faded ball cap that had once been green but had been washed so many times it was nearly colourless. He wore coveralls that had been patched and repatched over decades of use, and his hands were the hands of a man who had worked with them his entire life, scarred, calloused, stained with grease that had worked its way into the creases and would never fully wash out. He'd been a civilian contractor at this motor pool for 11 years, ever since retiring from a career that the young mechanics knew nothing about. To them, he was just Earl, the old guy who swept up, who fetched parts from the warehouse, who made coffee that was too strong and told stories that were probably exaggerated. He took a sip of his coffee, watched Torres fill out the defect form, said nothing. "Hey, Earl," Chen called across the bay. "You ever seen a wheel that just won't mount? Lugs won't align no matter what we do?" Earl looked up slowly. "What did you try?" "Everything," Torres said without looking up from his paperwork. "Jack height, angle of approach, different lug sequences. The holes don't line up with the studs, simple as that. Bad part." Earl took another sip of coffee. Torres finally looked over, annoyance flickering across his face. "You got a better idea?" "Didn't say that." "Then let us do our jobs, okay? Some of us actually went to school for this." The words hung in the air. Chen winced slightly. Webb looked at his boots. Earl's expression didn't change at all. "Fair enough," Earl said. He went back to his coffee. Torres returned to his form, satisfied that he'd put the old man in his place. He had a degree in automotive technology from before he'd enlisted. He had his certifications. He didn't need advice from some contractor who probably couldn't tell a torquey wrench from a tire iron. 20 minutes later, Sergeant First Class Williams walked into the bay. He was the motor pool NCO, a career soldier who'd been turning wrenches since before Torres was born. His eyes went to the Humvee, still on the jack, wheels still not mounted. "Status?" he asked. "Defective part, Sergeant." Torres handed over the clipboard. "Wheel assembly won't mount. Lug holes are out of tolerance. I've documented everything." Williams looked at the form, looked at the Humvee, looked at the wheel leaning against the fender. "You sure about that?" "Positive, Sergeant. We tried everything." Williams was quiet for a moment. Then he looked across the bay to where Earl sat on his oil drum. Coffee cup empty now, watching the scene with patient eyes. "Earl," Williams said, "you want to take a look?" Torres's jaw tightened. "Sergeant, with respect, we've been working on this for over an hour. It's not a technique problem, it's a manufacturing defect." "Earl?" Williams ignored the specialist entirely. The old man stood slowly, the way men stand when their joints have been worn down by decades of hard use. He walked over to the Humvee, his gait unhurried, his eyes taking in the scene the way a doctor examines a patient. He looked at the wheel on the ground, looked at the hub assembly on the vehicle, looked at the jack placement and the angle of the suspension. He didn't touch anything, just looked. "You tried to muscle it," he said. Not a question. "We tried proper mounting technique," Torres said. "By the manual." Earl nodded slowly. "Manual's good for a lot of things, not this." He walked to the back of the bay, past shelves of parts and tools and equipment, to a corner where forgotten things accumulated. Old rags, broken tools waiting to be repaired, and leaning against the wall, a crowbar that hadn't been touched in years. Rusted, pitted, the kind of tool that would have been thrown away anywhere else. He picked it up and walked back to the Humvee. "What are you doing?" Torres asked. "You can't use a crowbar on a wheel assembly. You'll damage the—" "Watch," Earl said. He didn't mount the wheel, not yet. Instead, he walked around the vehicle studying it. Then he did something none of the young mechanics had thought to do. He released the parking brake. "The vehicle needs to be secured," Torres started to say. "Safety protocol. It's on a jack. It's not going anywhere." Earl's voice was calm, patient, the voice of a man who had explained things to young people many times before. "But when you set the parking brake, you put tension on the axle, changes the alignment, just a fraction of a millimeter, but that's all it takes." He positioned himself next to the hub assembly and studied the studs. Then he took the crowbar and wedged it between the brake assembly and the axle housing. "What I'm doing here," he said, "is using leverage to rotate the axle about 1/2 degree. The weight of the vehicle is pushing down, the jack is pushing up, but the axle can still rotate slightly if you know where to push." He applied pressure to the crowbar. Not much, just steady, controlled force. "You learn this in a manual?" Chen asked, watching intently. "You learn this in the field," Earl said. "When you're in the middle of nowhere and the manual's back at base and the vehicle needs to move or people die." He gestured to Webb. "Grab that wheel. When I say now, slide it onto the studs." Webb picked up the heavy wheel and positioned himself beside the hub. Earl adjusted his pressure on the crowbar slightly. Watching. Feeling. There was something almost surgical about his focus, as if he could sense the metal shifting beneath his hands. "Now!" Webb slid the wheel onto the studs. It mounted perfectly, every lug aligned, smooth as if it had been designed to fit exactly that way, which of course it had been. Earl removed the crowbar and stepped back. "Torque the lugs in a star pattern. 85 foot-pounds first pass, then 120 on the second. You know the sequence." Torres stood frozen. His defect form hung limply in his hand. Sergeant Williams was smiling, just slightly, the smile of a man watching something he'd seen before but still appreciated. "How did you know to do that?" Chen asked. "That's not in any manual I've ever read." Earl walked back to his oil drum and sat down. Slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be. "Some things aren't in manuals," he said. "Some things you learn by doing, by failing, by being in situations where failure means people don't come home." Williams crossed his arms and leaned against the workbench. "Tell them, Earl. Tell them what you used to do." "Sergeant, they need to hear it. Torres especially." Earl was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, not louder, just carrying more weight. 30 years, United States Army. 22 of them as a wheeled vehicle mechanic. Last 12 as a maintenance chief. Retired as a master sergeant, E8. Torres's face changed. The superiority drained away, replaced by something else. The recognition that he had badly misjudged the man in front of him. "I did 3 tours in Vietnam," Earl continued. "Kept vehicles running in conditions that would make this motor pool look like a luxury garage. Mud up to the axles. Parts that were held together with wire and prayer. Mechanics who were kids, younger than you, who had to learn fast because there wasn't time to learn slow." He looked at his hands, the scars, the permanent grease stains. "After Vietnam, I did 2 tours in Germany during the Cold War. Then Desert Storm, then Bosnia, then 2 more tours in Iraq before I finally aged out. William spoke up. Earl was at Nasiriyah in 2003. You know what happened there? Chen shook her head. Torres said nothing. Convoy ambush. Worst enemy contact since Vietnam. Earl's unit was hit hard. Multiple vehicles disabled. Marines pinned down, taking heavy fire. Williams looked at the old man with something like reverence. Tell them what you did, Earl. Earl shook his head. That was a long time ago. They need to hear it. A long pause. Then Earl spoke, his voice flat, matter-of-fact, as if describing something that had happened to someone else. We had a 7-ton truck with a busted axle, middle of a firefight. Driver was wounded, couldn't be moved. Enemy was close. We needed that truck mobile or we were leaving men behind. He looked at the crowbar in his hands. Didn't have the right tools, didn't have time to wait for recovery. What I had was a pry bar and about 3 minutes before the enemy closed on our position. What did you do? Webb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I did what needed doing, used leverage and field expedients and 30 years of knowing how things work to make that truck move. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't by the manual, but 6 Marines went home that day who wouldn't have otherwise. He set the crowbar down on the workbench. The manual tells you how things should work. Experience tells you what to do when they don't. Both are valuable, but when everything goes wrong, experience is what saves lives. Torres set down his clipboard, his defect form, his careful documentation of a problem that wasn't really a problem at all. I'm sorry, he said. You were young, Earl said. Nothing to apologize for. Young means you haven't learned yet. That's not a character flaw. That's just time. He looked at the 3 specialists standing before him. Kids, really? Full of training and potential, and the confidence that comes from not yet knowing how much they don't know. The military spends a lot of money training you. Good training. Important training. But training can only take you so far. The rest you learn from experience, from people who've done it before, from failures that teach you more than successes ever could. He pointed at the Humvee, wheel now properly mounted. That wheel wasn't defective. The manual wasn't wrong. You weren't incompetent. You just hadn't encountered that specific problem before. Parking brake tension affecting axle alignment. It's a known issue to anyone who's spent enough time in the field, but it's not in the manual because some things are too situational to document. He stood again, walking to the Humvee and placing his hand on the newly mounted wheel. Every vehicle has quirks, every model, every variant. The Humvee suspension does this. The old Deuce and a Half had a thing with the fuel lines in cold weather. The 5-ton would eat transmissions if you didn't warm them up exactly right. You learn these things by doing, by maintaining hundreds of vehicles over decades, by talking to the old mechanics and actually listening instead of assuming they have nothing to teach you. Torres stepped forward. Can you teach us? Earl looked at him. A long, measuring look. The kind of look a man gives when he's deciding whether someone is worth his time. That depends, Earl said. You willing to learn? Really learn? Not just the manual stuff. The institutional knowledge that lives in the heads of people who've been doing this longer than you've been alive. Yes. Even when it means admitting you don't know something? Torres nodded. Especially then. Earl smiled. The first real smile any of them had seen from him. It transformed his weathered face, showing the man he'd been before age and mileage had taken their toll. Then get me a fresh cup of coffee and we'll start with the basics. The real basics. The stuff they don't teach you at Fort Lee. The morning sun was climbing higher now, the motor pool filling with the sounds of other mechanics arriving for the day shift. But in this corner, something different was happening. Something that had happened countless times throughout military history, in motor pools and machine shops and field positions around the world. Knowledge was being passed down, experience shared, the chain of institutional memory linking generations of soldiers who kept the vehicles running, who made the wheels turn, who ensured that when the infantry needed to move, they could move. Over the next few weeks, Earl became more than the old guy who swept up and fetched parts. He became a teacher. Torres, Chen and Webb became his students. They learned things that weren't in any manual, how to diagnose problems by sound, how to feel when a bearing was about to fail, how to keep a vehicle running with improvised parts when the supply chain failed. They learned about leverage and physics and the beautiful simplicity of mechanical advantage, how a man with a crowbar and understanding could accomplish what brute force never could, how thinking about a problem often mattered more than attacking it. And they learned about respect, not the kind that's demanded by rank or position, but the kind that's earned through decades of service, through knowledge accumulated one hard lesson at a time, through a willingness to share that knowledge with those willing to learn. 3 months later, Torres was deployed to Kuwait. Routine rotation, nothing special. But 6 weeks in, his convoy was hit by an IED. Multiple vehicles disabled. His Humvee had taken shrapnel to the suspension, and the right rear wheel was wobbling dangerously. The situation was bad. Exposed position, reports of enemy activity in the area. They needed to move, and his vehicle was holding up the entire convoy. He remembered Earl's lessons, not the specific technique. This was a different problem, but the approach, the thinking, the way Earl would look at a situation and see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. The parking brake was already off. Tension wasn't the issue. The issue was that shrapnel had bent the wheel studs slightly, just enough to prevent the lug nuts from threading properly. Another mechanic wanted to abandon the vehicle, call for recovery, let someone else deal with it. Torres grabbed a pry bar from the vehicle's basic issue items. "What are you doing?" the other mechanic asked. "Learning something." He used the pry bar not on the studs, but on the wheel itself, applying careful lateral pressure while his assistant threaded each lug. It wasn't in any manual. It was ugly, improvised, the kind of field expedients that would make a textbook instructor cringe. But it worked. The wheel mounted, the vehicle moved, the convoy completed its mission. That night, from a forward operating base in Kuwait, Torres sent an email back to Fort Hood. It was addressed to the motor pool general inbox, but there was really only one person he was writing to. "Earl, you won't believe what happened today. Actually, you probably will. You've probably seen it 100 times. We got hit. Vehicle was disabled. Everyone said we had to leave it. I remembered what you taught us. Not the specific technique, different problem, but the thinking, the approach, the idea that there's always a solution if you understand the fundamentals well enough. We made it back. Everyone made it back. I don't know if you'll ever see this. I don't know if they even let contractors read official emails. But I wanted you to know that what you taught us wasn't just about vehicles. It was about not giving up, about trusting experience, about respecting the people who came before us. Thank you for not giving up on me when I was too arrogant to listen. Thank you for teaching me anyway. I'm going to pass it on. Everything you taught me. I'm going to teach the next generation, and they're going to teach the ones after that. The chain continues. That's how it works, isn't it? That's what you were really teaching us all along." Torres. Back at Fort Hood, Earl read the email on a computer in the motor pool office. He read it twice. Then he printed it out, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket alongside another piece of paper he'd carried for years. A similar letter he'd received once, long ago, from a young soldier he'd taught in Vietnam who had gone on to do great things. The chain continues. Some lessons can't be written in manuals. Some wisdom can only be passed from person to person, hand to hand, generation to generation. The army calls it institutional knowledge. Old soldiers call it something else. They call it legacy. And somewhere in that motor pool, a rusty crowbar sits in the corner, waiting for the next time someone needs to learn that experience, patience, and a little bit of leverage can solve problems that strength alone never could. If this story moved you, wait until you hear what happened when a homeless veteran showed up at an auto shop looking for work. The owner's response? It'll change how you think about second chances. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet heroes and hard-won wisdom. Comment honor if you believe we should respect the knowledge of those who came before us, and hit that like button if you think experience deserves as much respect as education. The best teachers don't always have degrees. Sometimes they have scars and calluses and decades of learning what works when nothing else will. That's worth remembering.